Hey guys, my name's Dave, this is Custom Spray Mods, and this is part 2 of a series of videos that's going over all the products needed when you're taking on a spray painting or repair project. Yeah, there's quite a few products out there. It can be really confusing, so I wanted to go over all the different products to hopefully help you choose the right products for your project, and I'm going to go over that now. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this video is all about primers. What's the best primer to use, whether you've got repairs, bare metal, plastic. I'm going to go over all the different types of primers and hopefully it can help you choose the right one. So let's get into it. Okay, before you decide on what primer to use, make sure you know what kind of top coats you're going to use. So if you're going to use like a 1K acrylic or enamel top coat and clear coat, then it's kind of good to choose a 1K primer. If you're going to choose a 2K base coat or 2K color and then a 2K clear coat, then it's a really good idea to choose a 2K primer. So before you choose your primer, no matter what you're painting, you really should know what kind of top coats you're going to use. Now I've got a video that goes over the differences between 1K and 2K paints, so check that out and that can help you choose what kind of top coats you're going to use. So yeah, check that out. I'll put the link in the description, and once you know what kind of paints you're going to use, it's really easy to choose a primer. So let's get onto it. So now that you've chosen the top coats, it's time to think about what kind of project we're working on. So in this case, we're going to say we're working on some primer over body filler. Now when you're using primer over body filler, it's important to use a high build primer. So the high build primers are nice and thick, and it's going to allow you to put a nice thick coating over your repair, and that's going to help fill any low spots that you might have in your body filler repair. Sometimes the filler can sink a little bit, it can contract and cause a low spot. So by using the primer filler, it's going to go over that low spot and allow you to sand it nice and smooth and get that perfect finish. So if you're using 2K top coats and clear, then here are your options. You can use a 2K high build primer. Now this comes with two parts, so it comes with a primer and a hardener. Normally the hardener is quite harmful and should be done with a special spray mask and in a spray booth. So if you're going to use a 2K primer, make sure you have the proper safety equipment. The other option you have is a 2K high build epoxy primer. Now there are some epoxy primers that are a high build and they go directly to metal, directly over body filler and over a painted surface. Now the benefit of epoxy primer is it's really water resistant and it's got really good rust inhibiting properties. So if you're doing a long-term project, then an epoxy primer is the way to go because it's going to last without a top coat for a lot longer than the normal high build primer. There is another option called a polyester primer. Now this is basically like body filler and primer mixed together. It's a really high build product and it's going to help level your panels if you have any inconsistency as far as low spots or high spots. Basically the 2K polyester primer, they will build really heavy and allow you to block that back with some sandpaper and get a perfectly smooth finish. These go directly to metal. They're great for long-term restorations as they're quite water resistant, but they are normally double the price of a normal primer. Okay, now let's look at some primer over body filler when you're going to use a 1K top coat and clear option. So if you have body filler and you want to spray a 1K acrylic type primer, then it's good to use a spray putty. That's where you get the build from. But spray putty can't just go straight over the body filler. It needs a primer. So you have to spray a normal primer, then apply a spray putty, let that dry, sand it, and then you can spray a normal primer on top of that. Now you can get a 2-in-1 primer, which is a 1K acrylic primer filler, but it's not the best option as it doesn't last as long and it's not as a sturdy base as using the spray putty and primer option. One other thing to mention is that all 2K primers can be used with the 1K top coat and clear, but you don't want to be putting 2K paints over any of these 1K primers. So there are some good options when you have to prime over body filler repairs. So let's move on to the next project. So the next thing you might need to prime is bare metal. So you can prime bare metal, aluminium, stainless steel, even chrome. Yes, you can paint over chrome with the correct primer. I also use this type of primer to paint over anything that's been powder coated. Now these primers are a little different because they're normally compatible with both top coat systems. So 1K metal primers can work with 1K top coats and 2K top coats. Same with the 2K metal primers. So let's go over the different types. So firstly you have 1K etch primer. Now this is basically just mixed with thinners and sprayed onto a metal surface. You also have 2K etch primer. Now the difference is the 2K etch primer needs to be mixed with a catalyst. So there's two parts that need to be mixed. And the 2K etch primer is normally a lot stronger and it's a lot more, has a lot more adhesion when spraying over the metal. Another type of primer you can use for bare metal is an epoxy primer. Now the new style epoxy primers are quite good. They have a high build and they can be painted straight over. So all of these primers I've listed, you can paint straight over them. You don't need to put another type of primer on top. You can just sand them and then spray your paint and clear coat straight over those primers. So there are some differences between these two types of primers. The etch primers basically will dry a lot quicker than the epoxy primer. So that will allow you to get the job done quite quickly, like within an hour or two. So you can just spray the etch primer. Once it dries, you can sand it and then paint your top coats on top. Whereas the epoxy primer takes a lot longer to dry. You'd need to leave that a few days before you start sanding or applying body filler over it. The epoxy primer also gives a lot better protection for the bare metal. So if you have a long-term project, the epoxy primer will protect that metal and stop any chance of rust coming through or water being absorbed onto the metal, because the epoxy primer will form a really good seal from that moisture. It's also a great base to put down over your metal before you start doing some body filler repairs, like I mentioned in my last video. Okay, so now we're going to move on to plastic. And again, these primers are compatible with any top coats, so it doesn't matter what primer you use, you can use any top coat, 1K or 2K, on top of these types of primers. So when it comes to plastic, you can just use plastic primer. It's a dedicated primer. Most of the time it's clear. You can get colored plastic primer, but a lot of the time as well it's ready for use, so it doesn't need to be mixed with anything. It just needs a few coats over the plastic and then you can start spraying your color and clear. Now you can spray a normal high build primer over the plastic primer, but you can get a dedicated high build plastic primer, which basically is a thick plastic primer. It sticks to plastic and gives you enough body to allow you to sand if you've gone over any repairs. Great for scratches and great for plastic body filler repairs. So basically normal plastic primer for brand new plastic parts and high build plastic primer for plastic parts that needed repairs. So the next thing you might want to be priming is a painted surface. So maybe you've got a body panel that you want to put on your car and it's a different color. Well, it's a good idea to spray a primer. Spray a primer, then you can start spraying your color. So for this type of project, it's pretty simple. You'll use a primer surfacer. That's basically a primer that doesn't have much build to it. But you can pretty much use any of the primers we've just gone over on a painted surface. As long as you sand it first, you can spray any primer on it. Now, another option would be an adhesion promoter. An adhesion promoter is basically like a liquid spray that you would spray over a sanded surface, and then you can just spray the paint straight on top. Normally with primers, you need to sand them smooth, but an adhesion promoter does not need that sanding, so it's going to save a bit of time. Okay, some other things you might want to be priming are things like fiberglass or wood. And when it comes to fiberglass or wood, you can use any kind of primer on those products. So basically just choose the correct primer to suit the top coat that you're going to use. Now that we've gone over all the primers, I'd just like to mention a little trick that I like to use called wet on wet priming. Basically, I'll add an extra 30% thinners to the mix and then spray that on the job. Now this makes it so the primer lays down nice and smooth and nice and even, and basically then I don't have to sand it. So I can just spray the primer, then wait about 30-40 minutes, and I can start spraying my base coat and clear coat straight on top. And this is good for small parts like wheels, brakes, just small parts, but it saves you having to do that extra sanding step. Okay, so we've gone over all the different primers. Now make sure before you spray a primer, you sand with 240 grit sandpaper. Don't go any lower than that. If you go lower than 240 grit, then you might see some scratch marks. Now it doesn't matter what you do before 240 grit, as long as you step up your grits. So don't go sanding with 80 grit, then straight to 240 grit. Make sure you step up those grits, 80 grit, 150 grit, then 240 grit. That way you'll avoid seeing any scratches from that sandpaper. Okay, so when it comes to spraying the primer, spray gun is the best way to go, especially if you're using a high build primer. If you're using a high build primer, you want to use a 1.8 or 2 mil spray gun. And that is that hole in the end of the spray gun. That size hole can be a 1.8 or a 2 mil. And that's great for high build primer. If you're doing spray putty, which you want to get on nice and thick, then you can get a 3.5 mil nozzle, which is quite a thick nozzle, and this is actually called a putty gun. So that's designed for spray putty and polyester spray filler. So that's great if you've got a lot of repairs that you want to put spray putty on. Spray putty gun's good for that. Now you can use basically any size gun to spray a primer, but if you use a smaller nozzle, then you're not going to get as high build. So if you're just doing primer that you don't need to spray over repairs, then you can use any size gun. Just make sure you put a bit of thinners in the primer to allow it to flow and go on nice and smooth. Now, all the primers that we just went over, they're all also available in spray cans. So you can just do this if you don't have a spray gun. One thing is with the high build primer in a can, you just have to remember that when you're spraying from a can, you're only spraying from a very small nozzle size. So basically when you're spraying with a gun, the nozzle size is 1.8 mil. And when you're spraying primer from a can, the nozzle size is not even 1 mil, so it's very small. So you're not going to get the same amount of build from a spray can as you are from a gun. And that means it's not going to be as good a job, or you're going to use way too much product if you use a spray can. Now you have to remember that all these primers that I've mentioned, they're all available here in Sydney, in Australia. You might not have all these different primers available to you, or you might have different types of products. So just check the products that you buy. If you use it, make sure you know exactly how it's used and what it's used for, or ask the person that you're buying it from, because it's different all around the world. Well, thanks for watching. I hope that helped you. And again, if you need any of this stuff, if you're in Australia, then hit up our website. It's just vgautopaints.com.au. You can buy everything from there. We can send it to you. You can call us, ask questions, or you can send us an email or jump on the Facebook pages. But otherwise, I'll try and help you out if you've got any questions. Thanks again. See you next time.